All right, welcome everybody to Growing and Processing Staple Foods. I am Dean Gunderson, the Director of Education here at Seed St. Louis. If you don't know about us, we're a nonprofit here in the St. Louis region that works to support people who want to grow their own food. So if you're not in the St. Louis region, a lot of this will be helpful, but might not be, the exact dates and everything will probably be a little different. So first, just what is a staple crop or a staple food? So a staple crop is one that provides a staple food. And staple foods are simply foods that are, and this is like, a technical definition, is foods that are eaten regularly and in such quantities as to constitute the dominant part of the diet and supply a major proportion of energy and also nutrient needs. So this is generally not, broccoli or peas or something. It's usually something like wheat. In the States, a lot of times, wheat is a big, important food. If there's any celiacs out there, you know how difficult it is to eat in this country when you can't eat wheat, because it's like really the basis of a lot of our diet. In other parts of the world, it can be different. So what food is a staple varies widely based on geography and culture. So, there's some parts of the world where wheat just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to grow. It's either too wet or, just the climate is not really very conducive to growing wheat. And so they grow other things. Or, there's things that yield a lot better. Wheat isn't like really a great yielder, but it just works well here. But also, culture. One of the main reasons why wheat is important in the U.S. culture is that the U.S. culture is mostly dominated by European cultures, or people descended from European cultures, and wheat is the staple of Europe. And so, before Europeans were here, the staple of North America was corn, which is really a much higher yielding crop than wheat is. So culture also plays a really important part in what the staple food or staple crop is of a specific place. So just kind of start thinking, maybe what are some of your staple foods? So like what are the things that you eat a lot of? And oftentimes it's not just the evident plant, but it's like processed. Like wheat is a specific one that like most people aren't like going around eating wheat grains, but flour is made of wheat, pasta is made of wheat. Crackers, cookies, pretty much all baked goods. So just start thinking about, what am I eating? What are like those big important things? And that's probably the staple food and thus the staple crop of your specific diet. So staple crops, although there are quite a few of them, really just a small number of them really dominate the human diet. And this is also to show kind of how important these staple crops are. Oftentimes, people that are wanting to grow their own food, gardeners, people that are interested in local farming, are thinking about vegetables, and to kind of a lesser degree, fruits, maybe nuts, maybe, some eggs, things like that. But those are really a pretty small part of our diet, at least in terms of calories. So 15 crops, so like individual plants, provide 90% of all human calories when you're just like not counting meat. Like if you're looking at like plant calories, and like meat is a pretty small percentage of total calories. It's like 10% of all human calories. So like of that 90% left, 90% of those calories that all humans on the planet consume are just from 15 plants. That's a really small number when you consider that there's somewhere like 30,000 plants that humans are capable of eating, and we get 90% of our calories from 15. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of those are grains. So they're annual grasses. So that's rice, maize, wheat, sorghum, millet, rye, and barley. Starchy roots are another important one. These starchy roots tend to be more important in the tropics, but things like cassava, sweet potato, and potato, calorie-dense nuts and fruit, plantain, coconuts, and then legumes or pulses. So things like beans, like dried beans, like navy beans, pinto beans, cowpeas, things like that. soybeans, and peanuts. So those 15 plants right there provide 90% of the planet's calories. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about staple foods. We're talking about these like heavy hitters that really actually feed people and like fill your belly in terms of calories. And this is just a picture of some corn over here that I grow. So of those ones that we kind of that I just listed, and just other staple crops, but those 15 in particular, what do these kind of have in common? So they are calorie dense. So these are things that have a lot of calories for, like their volume. And they're particularly high in carbohydrates, and to lesser degree, some of them are high in calories from protein and or fat. So things like soybeans, a lot of their calories come from fat, and also protein. But those like grains that we're talking about, those starchy roots, most of their calories are coming from carbs, and particularly starch. That's a lot of starch. They store well for the most part. Even those starchy roots, store much longer and easier than a tomato or lettuce or spinach. They're pretty good long-term storers. They're relatively low labor to grow and harvest. And that's in comparison to growing like a same amount of space of vegetables. Growing an acre of corn is much less work than growing an acre of lettuce. And pretty much all of them are annuals. All of them that we consume regularly in the temperate climates are annuals. But in the tropics, there's some that are perennials, like coconut and plantain. And the most important ones, like I already kind of mentioned, are annual grasses. So those grains, corn, wheat, rice, barley, those are all annual grasses. So when we're talking about potentially growing and processing your own, kind of the big assumption that everybody makes is, the reason that we don't grow them is because you don't actually get that much. And that might be true, depending on how much space you're talking about. If you have one 4x8 raised bed, you're not going to feed yourself growing wheat in that 4x8 raised bed, but you're also not going to feed yourself growing lettuce in that 4x8 raised bed. So, it kind of depends on what your goals are. But it also can vary a lot depending on what staple crop we're talking about. So it depends on the yield differences. So the yield from crop to crop is just very different, in terms of, how much you're going to get per square foot. And even within like beans, like there's lots of different types of beans. So beans was one of those kind of at the bottom of that list of 15. But like this is a type of bean called matpe bean or black mung beans. And this size, like this thing back here is a towel. So if you kind of see, the size of the towel, like these are little itty bitty beans. And the whole plant is maybe only 6 to 8 inches tall. And so the amount that you get per square foot of these little itty bitty beans is pretty small. Whereas cowpeas, which are actually pretty closely related to this, you'll get maybe 3-4 times as much per square foot as you would from these beans. So even within beans, there's quite a bit of variation just in terms of yield. Also, things like corn are really high yielding. It's why we blanket the Midwest with them. It's very high yielding. So you're going to get more corn per square foot than you're going to get wheat or beans or even soybeans. So it can vary a lot per crop. There's also kind of what I would call like a consumption difference. So, if you think, oh, well, like the beans, I'm only getting, and I'm making up these numbers, but just as an example, like, oh, you only get a half a pound of beans per square foot, but you get a pound of potatoes per square foot. So you get a lot more food from the potatoes. Well, except when you cook beans, a cup of dried beans becomes like 3 cups of cooked beans. So like you actually end up with more. Like there's differences in kind of how you consume them. If you're boiling it and like adding water and it like bulks up, you're actually getting more food than it looks like when you're harvesting it, versus like wheat. Usually you're like grinding it up dry and you're baking it. Like wheat is not like puffing up in the way that rice or sorghum or millet or something like that, where you're kind of cooking the grain and it's absorbing a lot of moisture and getting bigger, would be. And then just also like available space. So like rice is one that, and we'll talk about rice because there's there's ways around this, but a lot of the rice that people think about is grown in like a flooded situation. And so you would need to have something that will hold water to grow that rice in. And so probably don't have a lot of that. And so you're like limited on that space. But kind of back to the original question, how much can you grow? If you're just talking about like a couple raised beds, it's not going to be a lot, but it's a fun exercise. I think they're really interesting to grow. They're really fun to grow. And in some instances, it can almost be like a replacement for a cover crop. Like winter wheat is also a great winter cover crop that then, you can harvest and then still plant your summer vegetables. And so you're actually getting more food because you're growing, it kind of depends on how you look at it. But unless you're growing a fair amount of space, it's not going to be a huge amount. But if you do have space out there, or you just want to try it as just something to try, or especially as like an educational exercise, if there's any teachers out there, or just if you're working with your own kids or other kids, youth programs or something, it can be really fun to grow and process grains just as an exercise in understanding where do these foods come from that are so important to almost all of our diets, really. Oop. So the staple crops for St. Louis. So, we listed all those, as I said, like, are the biggest ones coconuts. Spoiler alert, you're not going to grow those here. So like, which staple crops would work in St. Louis? So what are we looking for? We want crops that are calorie dense. So like we talked about, something that's going to have a lot of calories and provide carbohydrates, protein, and fat. So nutrients are important, but most of our nutrients are going to be coming from our fruits and vegetables. Our staple foods are really like, we want calories. Like that's really what they're providing for us, as well as nutrients as well, but to a lesser degree. We also, if you're wanting to grow some in your backyard and you don't have big equipment to do a lot of the work for you, you probably want ones that are relatively easy. And that's in terms of ease of growth, as in like they grow pretty easily without a whole lot of extra care or work or disease pressure, things like that. Ease of finding and collecting if you're foraging, which we'll talk about. That's not a big thing, but there's like one or two that we'll talk about that you can maybe forage. Ease of processing is a big one that we'll get into. Some staple things are really easy to grow, but they're a real pain to process. And so we're not really going to talk about those. And then yield. Some of them, like you can grow, but there's this other one that you can grow that's very similar that yields 4 times as much. So we're not really going to talk about the first one. And then fun or educational. Because again, I think that's an important thing, especially in these situations where, we're not commercial farmers, probably. We're not going to be feeding ourselves from this. So like ones that are also interesting and fun to learn about. So within those categories, or within those kind of parameters, there's 4 main categories of things that we end up with. Roots and tubers, grains or pseudo cereals. So these are like seeds that are high in carbohydrates. Pulses, so legumes, things like beans, peanuts, peas, and then nuts. And we'll talk about all 4 of those kind of in that order. So the first is roots and tubers. So these are probably the ones that you might already be growing. These are often talked about a lot as like vegetable growing, which they are. But roots and tubers are the ones that we're gonna talk about, and are definitely the easiest ones to get started with. If you have a vegetable garden and you want to kind of try growing, more of your own calories, roots and tubers are a great introductory way to do that. They're really straightforward to grow and harvest. It's not overly complicated. They really have little to no processing need. Really, the only kind of thing you need to do after you harvest is curing, which I'll talk about what that is, and it's not complicated at all. And they have pretty high yields. They're good yielding staple crops, and they're vegetatively propagated. So you're not growing these from seed. You're growing these from a vegetative thing, which I'll talk about that. And this is just a picture of potatoes here, which is one of the big ones. So the two big ones that are easy to grow, that we have experience with and we know are easy to grow, are potatoes and sweet potatoes. So potatoes are a cool season crop. So these are usually planted mid-March. We just had our seed potato sale last weekend. We're sold out, sorry, but local nurseries should have them as well. And the seed potato is just it looks like a potato, but it's one that's been tested and been shown to not have disease. And you plant either the whole potato, or you can cut the potato up into pieces, as long as each piece has at least 2 eyes, the little things where the sprouts can come out of on potatoes. And that's how you grow more potatoes. You either chop it up or you stick the whole potato in the ground. Those new sprouts come up, it grows more potatoes. You dig it up, you got potatoes. You harvest them when the tops die. So like when the whole top is dead, that's when you harvest them. If you're wanting to have like storage potatoes, like the big potatoes, you can harvest them earlier for like little new potatoes. But if you're wanting to grow lots of potatoes, you wait until the tops die down, which is usually sometime in July. And then for sweet potatoes, so these are warm season plants. So sweet potatoes are originally from the Amazon rainforest, so they do not like the cold. So you're not planting these in the spring. You are planting them in May. So a lot of people want to get them in earlier because the last frost date is mid-April, and that's true, but the ground is still cold, and these are from the rainforest. They want it hot. And so usually we wait until May, like mid-May, is a good time to plant those. You plant sweet potatoes via what are called slips, which just look like little shoots of a sweet potato plant. Like there's no root. Well, there might be roots, but it looks just like a little stem with a couple little leaves on the top. There might be some roots coming out the bottom, or there might not be. Either can work. And you just like stick that in the ground, just leaving the couple leaves on the top sticking up. And you just let them grow. And they grow, they produce lots of vines. The vines go all over the place. And then you just want to harvest those before a hard frost. So if we get like a light frost, if you ever see where like the leaves get burnt when it gets cold outside, you want to chop those vines and dig them up. Because again, they're from the Amazon rainforest. So if the ground freezes, they're going to turn to mush. They can't take any freeze at all. Like the roots cannot take any freeze. So you want to dig those up in the fall before that first frost, ideally. And that's with both potatoes. You're digging them up. And this is a picture over here of some volunteers digging up some sweet potatoes. So a digging fork is a great way to do that. If you have a digging fork, you can also use a shovel, but you just want to dig kind of a ways out from the plants and then try and get under them and lift them up, as opposed to digging right by the plant, because you will hit a potato or a sweet potato. And when you chop it, it gets all mangled and dirty and kind of gross. The other thing that's nice about sweet potato is the leaves are also edible. And they're pretty good. So it's kind of a twofer plant. You get the staple crop of the roots that got lots of calories and nutrients actually, and you also get a nice leafy green vegetable kind of all season long. For both of these, if you're like growing enough that you're not just going to eat them all in the next week or two, it's really good to do what's called curing. So this is simply a process of letting them thicken their skin. So when you first dig these up, the skins are really thin. You can really see this with potatoes, where you can almost just rub the skin off. And if the skin gets damaged, they're not gonna store a long time. They're gonna rot, they're gonna mold, they're gonna shrivel up, they're gonna do something. So you want to let them cure, which will allow them to thicken their skin. And all curing is putting these freshly dug tubers, don't wash them. When you dig them up, you can kind of like brush extra dirt off, but do not wash them. And then put them somewhere that is out of direct sun and that has good airflow. And that's it. And just leave them there for a couple weeks. You'll start to notice the skin getting thicker. And then once that's happened, once you've let them do that for a couple weeks, you can put them somewhere cool and like relatively high humidity. So like a basement is a good place. But also again, out of direct sunlight, and they will store for several months. I mean, quite a while that they will store. The curing process is also really nice for sweet potatoes because it makes them much sweeter. Like a freshly dug sweet potato is going to be much more starchy, and it is not going to taste like what most people think of when they think of sweet potatoes. So that curing is really a beneficial thing to do for sweet potatoes, even if you do want to eat them right away. But especially if you want these roots to store, it's really, really valuable to let your potatoes and your sweet potatoes do that kind of drying process to allow them to thicken their skin and sweeten up a little bit. So the other category, and this is the big category. So this is the one that most of our kind of staple crops come from. And that would be grains and pseudo cereals. So pseudo cereals are things like quinoa or amaranth that are not actually from grass. So grains are from grasses. So pseudo cereals are from other plants, but they're small seeds that are high in carbohydrates. So the characteristics of grains and pseudo cereals is that they are, like I said, seeds of grasses and a few other plants. They are high in carbohydrates, like mostly carbohydrates. They have varying levels of protein. So some, like corn, have very, very little protein, whereas some, ones like amaranth have quite a bit more, but are still overwhelmingly carbs. And then they tend to have very, very little fat. And that's one of the reasons why they store for so long. Fat will go rancid if it's stored for a long time. And so these grains have been bred to have a pretty small amount of fat because they store longer, which is valuable with a staple crop. So it makes it easier to ship it and to store it from year to year so that you have food, all winter long and stuff when you're thinking about, big societal wide things. So unlike roots and tubers, there is some processing needed. So, it's not like a root or tuber where you just dig it up and there you go, you've got your food. You do need to remove them from the plant and kind of clean them in some way. And the process to do that is there's two steps. There's threshing and there's winnowing for all of the ones that we're going to talk about. For some, they also have hulls. So a hull is just like a tight, papery skin over each individual seed. So almost all grains have this, but we have bred some of our grains to not have this. Like in the wild, all grasses have this, but we've bred some of our grains to not have this, or we've bred some that when you remove the seed from the head, the hull just falls off. These hulls, when you have grains that do have these hulls, they can be very hard to remove, especially on the small scale that we're probably all working. And it adds another step to that kind of cleaning process. It's more work to do that. And so because of that, we are mostly going to be talking about ones that do not have hulls, because they are the ones that are the easiest for people to kind of get introduced to, and to grow themselves without any special equipment. I'll talk about a few with hulls because we have found a way to do some dehulling, and I'll give you tips on that. But for the most part, it's a lot of work and it's a pain. And so we're mostly going to talk about ones that we have found that do not have that hulling step. So we're just doing threshing and winnowing. And just in case you were wondering, this picture over here is a specific type of quinoa that we found that does really well here in St. Louis that I'll talk about. But so the ones that are what's called naturally free threshing. So these are ones that either have no hulls or the hulls fall off during the threshing process. So these are the ones that I would definitely recommend, especially if you are new and you're wanting to start doing this. These are the ones that I would recommend, and they're pretty much the only ones that I grow. I don't grow hardly anything with hulls because they're a real pain. But these are things like corn, which I think we all kind of know what corn is. Sorghum, which is another grain. It produces seeds that are they're round. They're smaller than rice, but much bigger than quinoa. So they're kind of a nice size. There's pearl millet, which this is a picture of pearl millet here on the left, which is a little round grain that is, again, probably maybe 2-3 times bigger than quinoa in size, but is still relatively small. There is amaranth, which is what this picture is down here. There's a couple different types. This is a red and an orange type amaranth. It's grown a lot as a flower, but it's a food. Those little seeds are edible and pretty good and very similar to quinoa. So that's another one, that threshes free. And then this quinoa in the last slide that I mentioned is called Taiwanese quinoa. So it's actually not quinoa; it's a different species, but the seeds are the same size, they taste the same, you use them exactly the same. So it's another Chenopodium species. So quinoa is Chenopodium quinoa. The Taiwanese quinoa is, I believe, Chenopodium taiwanica, I think is the name. So it's a quinoa, or it's a Chenopodium species that is indigenous to the island of Taiwan, and the indigenous people of that island domesticated it thousands of years ago. And it grows much better here than quinoa. I feel like quinoa is the grain that I get asked about the most, and it's just about the only grain that you can't grow here. Quinoa really likes a really cool, low humidity summer, and that's not at all what our summers are. And so they really struggle in our heat, but they can't take the cold. So they just don't really like it. But this Taiwanese quinoa, being from the island of Taiwan, doesn't have any issues of dealing with heat and humidity. And then there's another one that is a relatively new one in terms of being able to get seed for. It's been around for a long time, but it's one that is a domesticated form of a plant called Sonoran panic grass. I do not know how to pronounce this appropriately, but sagui is my guess. So this is a crop that was indigenous to the what's now the southwestern part of the United States and the northwestern part of modern day Mexico. It was grown there for a long time, so it's incredibly heat and drought tolerant. It's grows in those desert areas, but I haven't really had any issues in terms of fungal disease. Like the humidity here doesn't really seem to bother it, and so it's another good one to grow in the summer. It has these seeds that are very small. They're probably about the size of quinoa, but it grows in these droopy kind of grass heads. So you can see me holding it here, and I mean the seeds are very small, but all of those little brown dots are seeds that you kind of get off the seed head, and they're little starchy grains, which are pretty good. That again you would use just like you would use like a little quinoa or a really tiny rice or something like that. So all of those in that list are warm season crops. So these are all things that you would plant after all chance of frost has passed. So mid-April or later is when you would be planting all of these. And all of them are planted by seed. So, you're not doing vegetative propagation or anything. You would all do them from seed. And I would recommend doing them like direct seed. Like you could do them as seedlings, I guess, but they all grow pretty quickly. You don't really need to do seedlings of these unless you really want to for some other reason. And then there are ones that usually have hulls, but there are certain varieties that you can find that are free threshing. So these were usually called hullless, as in Hulless, or free threshing, like it says up there. So these would be things like wheat, barley, and oats. So all of those normally have a hull. So like if you see one and it doesn't say free threshing or hullless, it has a hull, and you probably don't want to grow it. But if you find one that says free threshing or hullless for wheat, barley, or oats, those work just fine. And this is a picture here of some wheat that I grew. And I just, it was hullless, grew beautifully. But you do need to look for one that says that, because if it doesn't say that, it's going to have a hull. And especially things like oats, if you have an oat with hulls on it, you're not getting the hull off. It's just not going to happen. They're very difficult to get the hulls off of those. So all three of those are cool season. So these are ones that you are planting either in very early spring, or there's also winter types. So if you're doing a spring type, these are ones that you're planting like as soon as the soil can be worked. So like when you're planting peas, or even a little earlier, you can plant them usually like late February, early March, as long as the soil is dry enough that you can actually work the soil to plant the seeds. And then there's fall types, which are the ones that I really like. And especially like if you want to grow wheat, fall wheat or winter wheat is really the way to go. And it's like what all commercial farmers around here that grow wheat, it's all winter wheat. Nobody grows spring wheat around here. So fall types you plant in mid-October. So the same time you're planting garlic is when you'd be planting winter wheat. And then it's almost on the exact same schedule as garlic. So you plant it kind of mid-October, and this would be for barley and oats as well, if you can find them that are winter types. They're gonna germinate. You're gonna have like a little little short little lawn of grass. And then they're going to stay that small kind of all winter. And then around now, as it starts getting warmer and the days are getting longer, it's going to start growing, and you're going to harvest it sometime in June. Again, pretty much on the exact same schedule as garlic, if you've grown garlic. For all of these grains and pseudocereals that we've talked about, for planting, they can be planted so they're all planted by seed, like I talked about. You're not doing vegetative propagation. You don't have to do seedlings. If you do seedlings, you would plant it just like you would any other seedling. But if you're doing it from seed, you can plant individually in rows, just like you would with vegetables. You can kind of draw out lines and stick individual seeds. And the spacing is different on all of them, but it's pretty easy to look up and find spacing on them. And for things that get big, plants that get relatively big, and so that would be things like corn, sorghum, that Taiwanese quinoa, and amaranth. They are usually easier to do planted in rows, where you etch it out and you're planting kind of individual seeds, or you're sprinkling along the row and then thinning out the row, just like you would with vegetables in your garden. But with a lot of the other ones, so things like the sagui, or the Sonoran panic grass, or pearl millet, or the wheat, the barley, the oats, those plants are very small. Like an individual wheat plant is maybe this wide, and like this whole thing. And so you can plant those individually, but if you're planting a whole bed, that's a lot of individual planting of seeds. And they're more adaptable than like a head of cabbage. If they're a little cramped, they're still okay. And so those tend to be easier to do and much faster to do broadcast. So this is where you do, probably not on this scale, but what this guy is doing here, where you have the seed and you just kind of like either toss it, or in a more raised bed situation, you kind of sprinkle it around on the soil. And you do that on soil that's been loosened up. It's worked up a little bit. And then once you do that, if you're broadcasting, it's then good to either go with your hands, is how I usually like to do it, just with my hands, just kind of rub it across the soil surface, which helps kind of push the seed in contact with the soil, and kind of move some of the looser dirt over the top to kind of cover it a little bit. You can also do that with a rake to some degree. I find it's a little harder to do that, and it's kind of easy with a rake unless you're like really delicate and like comfortable with doing it. It's easy to just kind of like rake it, and then you end up with a bunch of seeds in one spot. Whereas with your hands, it's a little easier to just kind of rub over the top of the soil surface. So that's what I recommend for those smaller things. You can also do it for smaller seeded things like quinoa or amaranth, or maybe even sorghum. But because the plants get pretty big, you usually end up having to do a lot of thinning if you do that. Corn, I would not recommend broadcasting corn. The seed is so big, it's probably just going to sit on the top of the soil and a bird's going to come and eat it. So yeah, that's really all, and that's really all planting is with these grains. They're pretty tough as long as you're getting them into some loose soil, and then you water it. So as soon as you plant it, water it. And then if you want to do some straw or some mulch, especially if you have a lot of birds that like to peck around in your garden, throwing a little bit of straw or chopped up leaves or something over the top can be helpful, especially if it's those broadcast seeds. If they're like fully planted, you don't need to worry about that. But if it's broadcast seeds, throwing a little bit of kind of mulch-like material on top can kind of help discourage the birds until they germinate. And they usually germinate pretty quick. I mean, like a matter of days, they're going to come up. So as long as they get water. So a bit of a special case is rice. So rice is one that they all have hulls. You have to remove the hull. It's a pain. But it's a really interesting crop to do, especially from like an educational standpoint. So there are two types of rice. So if you've ever seen pictures of rice, or you've like looked into rice, you probably think, oh yeah, rice grows in flooded conditions, which is pretty unique and kind of interesting. And that's where it's like literally growing in standing water. So like this picture up here is a bed that we made for rice, and we're planting it into this standing water. If you're wanting to do that, there's a variety called Koshi Hikari, which is a Japanese variety that does pretty well for us. So this is a picture of some koshi hikari that was grown in this bed here. So this was us planting it, and this was it a couple months later at harvest. So that one does pretty well. But there's also what's called upland rice. So this is rice that you would grow in the ground just like any other vegetable or grain plant. Doesn't need to be flooded. It doesn't need any more water than like sweet corn would need or a standard vegetable garden would need. It's just been bred for different things, but it's still rice. It tastes the same. It's the same species. It's a wild plant. So if you're wanting to do those, the three that we have found the most luck with are these. And again, I'm sure I do not know how to pronounce these appropriately, but Kurimuvaza, Kagama Dango, and Choseonzo Sang. Again, I'm sure I butchered that, but those are the three that we've had the most luck with. I believe they are all Japanese or Korean varieties. I know like Koshi Hikari is Japanese. The Choseon I know is Korean, and I believe these top two might be Japanese as well. And that tends to be the rice that does well here. Rice from more like Southern Asia it won't produce seed fast enough with how far north we are. But there's different triggers that create the that tell the plant to start producing seed on those more northern varieties from Korea and Japan and some northern areas of China that do well. So you can experiment and try and find other types, but these are ones that we know that have done well for us here in St. Louis. If you're wanting to do rice, for flooded rice, you pretty much have to do seedlings. The seedlings grow really fast, which is why most grains, we don't do seedlings, but because it's flooded, it's pretty hard to plant seeds. They just tend to kind of float up. So for doing seedlings for rice, you start that seedling in late April, and then you're going to transplant mid-May. Like you're growing them for like 2 or 3 weeks, pretty much. Like that's it. In little cells, little pots, whatever you want to do. For the upland rice, you can direct seed it. I've done that the last couple of years, and it's worked pretty well. You can do seedlings if you want for rice, but it also does okay direct seeded if it's those upland types. And if you're going to do direct seeding, you want to do that about mid-May for upland rice. If you want to do the flooded rice, the koshi hikari, you will need a paddy, so a thing that you can hold water and also soil. So that can be, again, really anything that will hold water. So that can be a bucket. You can have like a 5-gallon bucket that you put soil in and then flood it. You can have an old bathtub, like a stock tank, like a big like water tank for horses or cows. You could use a kiddie pool, or you can do what we did here, which is we built a raised bed and then we lined it with a bunch of plastic and then we filled it. So it's just like a big container and then it floods. But you'll just need something that will hold water. And in terms of growing it, it's really, if it's the flooded rice, it's just when it's not flooded anymore, add more water. Like that's all you're doing in terms of managing the floodedness. And as long as it doesn't have a leak in it, it doesn't need to be refilled very often. And you're not flooding it much, like just like an inch or 2 is plenty. You just want that standing water in there if you're doing a flooded rice. So for harvesting these crops, because in terms of growing them, they're pretty low maintenance. That's why we're able to grow thousands of acres of them with a tractor, because it doesn't need a lot of hands-on work for the most part, other than you will need to weed them. They tend to grow pretty quickly and pretty densely, so you don't need to usually do a whole lot of weeding compared to vegetables, but you will just need to weed them. Most of them don't need a lot of supplemental watering because, again, we grow them just out in fields where, at least around here, we're not usually irrigating our fields. And so you don't need to water them. It can be helpful to water them, to get them to germinate, to get them when they're young. And then if we have, a long dry spell, it doesn't hurt to water them to just like help them to grow a little faster. And if it's like part of your garden and you're watering them, that's fine. Like it's not a problem to water them at all, but they don't need as much water as, lettuce, spinach, tomatoes, those things. You harvest them when the seed is hard, basically, is how you know when they're ripe. So some plants like wheat, which is what this picture is here, the whole plant kind of dies when the seed gets hard, so it's pretty easy to tell. But some other things, um, like sagui or rice, or the Taiwanese quinoa, the plant doesn't turn brown and die when it's ready to harvest. You need to kind of check the seeds, and you do what's called the bite test. So you just you pick off a seed and you stick it between like two of your molar teeth, and you carefully, because you don't want to break a tooth if it is dry, you just kind of carefully bite down on it. And if it's soft and chewy, because there's also what's called like a dough stage where it is kind of like a chewy, kind of like a dough, it's not dry yet. It's not ready yet. Whereas if you go to bite on it and it's hard, like you're like, I don't want to chew this, it's uncomfortable, then it's ready to harvest. It's dry. So you do that. For wheat, barley, and oats, this is going to be when the whole plant has turned this color. And for those three, you're going to cut it all the way down to the ground. You'll just cut the whole plant. And that's what I'm doing here. You can see this whole area back here was also wheat, and you can see these piles here. So that's I'm cutting it at the base. And you can cut it with whatever you have to cut. You can use pruners, you can use loppers, you can use a big machete, you could use scissors, you can use a knife, whatever you got. For rice, you're also going to cut the whole plant. But for rice is interesting in that the seed head will turn this straw color when it's ready and when the seed is hard, but the leaves are still going to be bright green. So you're not waiting until the whole plant turns brown. If you do that, the birds will have already ate your seed for the most part. So you want to look, and when the seed head is turning golden, usually it's going to turn that nice golden color and it's going to start drooping. The seed heads are going to be heavy, and then you go to bite it, it's hard. Cut the whole plant, even though the leaves are still green. For all of the other grains, for the most part, what I like to do is to just cut off or break off the whole seed head and put it in like a bag, a big bucket, a tub, a wheelbarrow, something. So like with corn, you don't need to cut the whole corn plant. You can just break off the ear. With amaranth and sagui, like on this picture, you don't need to cut this whole plant. You can just cut these like bright colored seed heads when the seeds are dry and hard. The same with like this sagui. These plants can get really tall and kind of spindly. You can just break off just like right here, just the seed head, and throw it in a tub, which is what I do. And like with the pearl millet, same thing. You're just breaking off this seed head instead of trying to cut this whole plant, because these can be like 7 feet tall. Same with sorghum. You can just break off the seed head, which is up top like this, but it's kind of more open. It's not like a big cigar shape. So you're just cutting off or breaking off just that seed head and then throwing it into a container. And then you can deal with the rest of the plant however you want. It's just mulch material for you at that point. So then you're going to dry it. So for like the wheat, for all of them, they thresh, which is the removing the seed from the plant. Much easier if you let them dry first. So for all of these, you're going to let them dry. For the plants, so like this is rice here. You can kind of bundle them. Usually makes it easier. So you can see where we use some string to tie them into little bundles. That can be easier to just move them. And then you can either kind of pile them or like lay them out like on a table or on a floor or something. Or you can hang them up if you like want to put them in a shed and like rodents are a problem. Like if you pile a bunch of grain like this on the floor, anywhere where there's rodents, they're going to get into it and it's going to be gross. So you can like tie in these bundles and like hang them from the rafters of a shed or a garage or a barn or wherever you are. Or, if you're inside, it's a smaller thing. You can lay them out on a table, or you can just leave them in a big tub. Like if you got like a big tub, you can throw the plant in there to dry. And that's especially the case for the ones where you break off the seed heads. You can do the same thing, lay them out, put them in a big tub, just somewhere where they're going to get some airflow and they're going to be able to dry without molding. Like that airflow is important. If you just heap a whole bunch of like stuff into a tub, like a plastic trash can, and just leave it there, it's going to mold, which you don't want, because then you just spent all that time and you wasted it. So like laying it out somewhere with some airflow is nice. And then once it's dry, and it'll feel dry because like you'll feel it, and like if there's any plant material, it's brittle, it'll break. You're threshing. So for threshing, there's a couple ways to do it. You can hand strip the seeds, which is just pulling the seeds off the seed head. You can use the trash can method, which is especially for like a whole plant. You like stick the seed head ends of the plant into a trash can and just bang it on the sides of the trash can. You can rub them on a screen. So I like to do that for like really small seeded things like amaranth and quinoa do well for that, just like with a window screen, and you stick the plant on and just with your hand, you just rub it back and forth, and it'll rip those seeds off of that. And a lot of the seeds will fall through the screen, which is nice. You can use a larger whole screen for things like sorghum or pearl millet. Like if you have like a hardware cloth or something, you can do the same where you rub it on that and it'll rip the seeds off. And then you'll end up with this, where there's a bunch of just like grain and like other stuff in the bottom of a trash can, a tub, a wheelbarrow, wherever it is that you're doing this. And then you can kind of just like pull out the big chunks that you see. So kind of like a rough cleaning. And then you're going to do dehulling if you have something with a hull. So something like rice or, if you did a hulled wheat or something. But for rice, it works pretty well. To dehull it with this machine that we made. You can dehull by hand, and you'll find instructions online of like rub it between two cutting boards or like different things. Those things don't work. It doesn't work. Or at least it doesn't work if you're trying to eat food. It can work as a like, oh, that was interesting. Yeah, that really sucked. Like, it's a good way for you to see that, but it is not a practical way to get any significant amount of food dehulled. We did make this little device, which we have instructions for on our YouTube. That I think it's like $35 to make, and it's pretty simple. It's basically a really cheap corn grinder that we glued some pieces of rubber onto the grinding plates so it rubs instead of grinding the grain. And you end up with this, which it's a little hard to see in here, but if you can kind of see those individual rice grains, and then there's all that kind of little dusty stuff around it. So that dusty stuff is the hull that got rubbed off by this kind of these rubber sheets here. So that works really well for rice. It works okay for things like hulled wheat or hulled barley. It doesn't really work for oats. Oats are really hard to get the hulls off of. And it does also work if you're like having a hard time cleaning like quinoa or something like that, like running that through something like this really speeds up the cleaning process, I have found. And again, those instructions are on our YouTube. And there should be like actual like physical paper plans on our that you can like download on our website as well. So then you winnow it, which is removing all this little dusty stuff from the actual grain, because that's what you want, is the seed is what you're eating. So you can do the bucket method, which is what I do, which is where you have all of it in one bucket, and then you have another empty bucket, and you pick up the bucket with all the grain and you just pour it. And you do that outside when there's a breeze, and the breeze will blow that chaff, it's called, so all that like dusty debris that you don't want out, whereas the heavier grains will fall straight down into that bucket, and you just go back and forth with that until it's clean. It can also help if there's not a nice breeze outside. You can set up a fan to blow and do the same thing. If you have a smaller amount of things, you can use the bowl method, which I don't have a good illustration of, but it's if you get like a big bowl and you kind of like swirl it around and you just kind of blow into it, and it'll kind of help blow the debris out. But if you're doing a lot, don't do that. It gets hard on the lungs to do that. But if you have just like a small amount of grain, that's an easy way to do it. All right, I know I'm going a little long here. And then there's the oddity that is corn. So corn is a grain. It is a grass, believe it or not. But it's totally different in what it does. So you break off the ear off of the stalk. You can dry it in the husk. And then the dehulling is just pulling the husk off the corn. So this papery thing off the corn. This is a really tiny popcorn. That's not what grain corn usually looks like. And then the threshing is just picking the seeds off of the cob. So corn is a little different. So then pulses. So pulses, so these would be like beans and peas and stuff like that. So there's bush and there's vining types. So pulses are different from cereals and pseudo cereals, and that the main thing that they have is protein. So they're still actually mostly carbohydrates, but they have a significant amount of protein. So pulses were always a really important part of the diet in most cultures because they provided the protein and the grains provided the carbs. They're some of the easiest things to grow in terms of staple foods, but there's bush and there's vining types. So bush varieties are best if you are growing a large area and you want to kind of harvest everything at once. If you have a smaller amount of space, pole or vining varieties are nice because they actually yield more per square foot, but they're more work. So they're nicer if you have a smaller space because you can get more food from them. Those pole or vining types will need a trellis, so they are more work. And they will produce over a longer period, so you need to keep harvesting, whereas the bush types are usually where you come and you kind of harvest all at once. So a lot of the pulses or the beans are warm season, so things that you would plant again after all chances of frost are past, and these are pictures of just some of them. So the common bean is the big one, which I actually don't think I have a picture of on here, which is a little funny, but that's the one that most people would probably want to grow. So that's like navy beans, black beans, pinto beans, you know, white beans, like all of those are actually all the same species. Those are all common beans. But there's also cowpeas, which are my favorite to grow. So that's what this pod is here. So black-eyed peas are a vegetable type of cowpea, but there's cowpeas that are grown for their dried pods, or dried seeds, which are usually just called cowpeas. There's tepary beans, which is what these are here on the right, that just look like small common beans. There's lima beans, which I also don't have a picture of here. I think I did somewhere though. But those are, the big like vegetable limas is what most people think about, those green canned things. But you can also eat them dried. Pigeon pea, which is what is in this picture here, you can grow. Soybeans you can grow. Matpe beans, which is this little tiny pod here. And I think in like the second or third slide, I have that little picture that I mentioned where matpe beans. There's adzuki beans, which is what this one is here, which just look like little tiny cowpeas. And then there's mung beans, which is what these are here. These were two different varieties that I grew, which are very similar to adzuki beans. Adzuki beans are red. Matpe beans are black, and mung beans are green, but they all are like the exact same size bean and look the same, and I think taste the same, but they look very different. And then peanuts, which are kind of an odd one out, but peanuts are also pulses. All of these you're going to plant after the chance of frost has passed. You're going to plant them as seeds, and you'll plant them just like you would like green beans. Like they're basically green beans that you just let over mature and turn into hard seeds. The vining form should be planted with a trellis if you grow any that have big long vines. There are some cool season ones. So lentils, peas. There's peas that you can grow as like grain peas, like split pea soup kind of things. There's fava beans, and then there's chickpeas or garbanzo beans. So for all of these, you would plant the first week of March or the second week, third week, in early March. And then there are some that can actually be overwintered. There's only a few varieties that I have found will do this, and so I listed those there. If you're wanting to grow grain peas or lentils or favas where you plant in the fall, like in October, and then overwinter and then harvest in mid to late spring, those are the varieties that I would recommend. For harvesting, it's the same for all of these. When the pods are dry, you pick the pod. That's it. If it's a pole variety, they usually will ripen over an extended period, and it's best to harvest those individual dried pods about once a week. Bush varieties, you can harvest individual pods and they'll produce for a while, or you can just wait until most of the pods are mature, and then you can just cut the whole plant like at the ground and then hang them up or pile them up somewhere to dry. And a lot of those other pods will mature. And do it that way. That's another option for dried beans. For processing, basically, you can just put the whole pod. If you have a few, you just break open the individual pods. But if you're growing a lot, you can put the whole plant or just the pods in a big bag, like a burlap bag, and then either agitate it, like with your hand, you can kind of like smash it, you can stomp on it, or like smack it on the ground, and those pods will burst open as long as you have let the plants dry. And then all the seeds will pretty much settle to the bottom, and the lighter plant material will come to the top. So you can just kind of then shake the bag and then reach in and pull out the plant material, throw it out, and you'll end up with seeds on the bottom. Peanuts are different because the peanut actually grows below the ground, although it's a bean, but it gets pollinated above the ground and then it buries itself. So you need to dig up peanuts, and then you can hang the whole plant, or you can break off the individual pods if you need to, which is what we did here. Was we dug it up and we broke off the individual pods, and then you let the pods dry because the pods are going to be kind of wet. So let the pods dry, and then you would treat it just like an in-shell peanut. You can either boil it or roast it whole, or you can break them open and then roast the individual peanuts inside. And then nuts, this is the last category. I know I'm right at time, but I do want to touch on these if you all bear with me here, because they can be some great ones, and I'll move through them fast. So almonds, which is one that usually shocks people because everybody thinks almonds can only be grown in California. And that's what I thought too, until I found this one great almond called Reliable that is actually a hybrid with a peach. And so it looks just like a peach, like the flowers look like a peach. They start producing these little fruit that look like peaches. But then about midsummer, you're like, these peaches don't look real good. And they will split open like this. And then this pit falls out, and you get this pit, and you crack it open, and you get these little almonds inside, which look really tiny in this picture, but you then need to roast them. You don't want to eat raw. You roast them, and when you roast them, they actually puff up, and they get to be like, I've compared them, and they're like the same size as the almonds from the grocery store once you roast them. And so don't go out eating peach pits. This is a specific one that is a hybrid that has been bred for good to eat pits like an almond. Don't eat peach pits; they're poisonous. But this one variety called Reliable. There's another one called Javid's Iranian that is a pure almond, so it has white flowers and it looks like an almond as it's growing. That I think is going to do well, but it's really hard to find like a source for. Which hopefully will be easier in the future. But that's another one that is a good candidate for our climate. But I know that Reliable works here. So that's one that can be good. Chestnuts are a really great one. If you're looking for like a nice big shade tree to plant in your yard, chestnuts are a great one. They are very strange in the nut world. Usually when we think of nuts, we think of things that are like oily and high in protein. Like that's what people think about, like, oh, nuts are a good, low carb, high protein fat or high protein snack. Chestnuts are the complete opposite. They're basically a potato on a tree. They are high in carbs, very low in fat and protein, and very high in water. So they're also not shelf stable on their own. They need to be refrigerated or dried in order to not mold. Like they're almost more like they're very similar to a potato or like a vegetable. If you want to grow these, you want to grow the Chinese chestnuts. The American chestnuts, if you plant them, will get blight and they will die. They're currently working on breeding some that will do okay, but they're not available to the general public yet. So if you're wanting to grow ones for nuts, you want the Chinese chestnuts. The Chinese chestnuts are also much bigger and they're really sweet. So there's also like European chestnuts. They will also get the blight, and they are just like a potato. They're very bland. They're very starchy. The Chinese chestnuts are sweet. Like they're really tasty. The kind of one limiting factor of them is they do need a pretty good soil drainage. So like they don't like real heavy clay, and they need a slightly acidic soil pH. So the soil needs to be like a 5.5 to 6.5. So some soils in St. Louis are closer to 7 or even higher. They're not going to like that. So if you really want to do chestnuts, it's worth doing, spending a couple bucks to do a pH test. Harvesting for chestnuts is just you let them fall on the ground, and when they're on the ground, you pick them up. That's it. They do grow in these like spiky burrs. Usually they will fall out and just the nut will be on the ground. But if they're in that spiky burr, you need to pull that spiky burr off carefully to get to the nut. You can just eat the nut. The shell is flexible, so won't crack like other nuts. So what you do is you score it. You can find videos online. You score it with an X on the top, and then you roast it. That's why like chestnuts roasting is like a thing, is you actually roast it. That's how you get the shell off, is you roast it. Then the shell becomes brittle. You just break it off, and then you can eat it. And they're really good fresh. Or if you're growing a lot and you want to preserve them, you can freeze them, or you can dry them. Like once you get them out of the shell, kind of, chop up the nut or grind up the nut and then dry it and then grind it into a flour. This is some chestnut flour that I made. It's heavenly. It's very sweet. It's like you can use it in baking. It's very, very good. Hazelnuts are another one. That is one that I actually just added to this class at the last minute because I just finally cracked the code on how to process them. You want either an American hazelnut, or what's better in terms of yields is the American or European hybrid, or they have just released a few European hazelnuts, which have much bigger nuts that are resistant to a disease that we have here. Most European hazelnuts, if you plant them, they're just going to die because we have a disease here that they're not adapted to. But there's a few that have been released, and this is the list of those varieties there that you can get that will grow here that are disease resistant. But yeah, don't just grow like a European hazelnut seedling. It's probably going to grow for a couple of years and then die, and that's a real bummer. These grow as large shrubs, and when I say large, I'm talking usually like 10 to 20 feet, like big, but they are shrubs, like they're multi-stemmed for the most part. The European hazelnuts are going to grow as a multi-stem. If you look up pictures of hazelnuts, people talk about hazelnut trees and the pictures, they look like trees. That's because the European hazelnuts are like, those are the ones that are closer to like 20 feet. They prune them to be single stem because it's easier to harvest, but it's going to want to grow like a shrub. The American are a shrub. You can maybe prune it to one stem, but it'd be very hard. And the same with the American and European hybrids. They really are like a many-stemmed shrub. And they're a little shorter. The Europeans can get like really tall. The American European hybrids are like 10, 15 feet maybe. So the way that you harvest them is they grow in these little clusters like this that I'm holding. That's all like one thing, and they grow on the ends of branches. So the way that you harvest them is, and this is usually in like August sometime, is you want to go out and they have this like papery husk on them, and you want to go and you want to look, and when the nut is brown, but when this husk is still green, that's the best time to harvest them because the squirrels don't know that they're ripe. If you leave them on until the whole thing turns brown and you have a lot of squirrels, the squirrels probably are going to come and steal them from you. So you go around and you check, and when the nut is brown, but the husk is still green, kind of grab the whole husk in your hand and kind of gently pull on it. And if it pops off, take it. If it doesn't want to come off, don't take it because it's not actually ripe yet. It can be a little tricky. You'll figure it out after you do it once or twice. But picking them early and often helps avoid the squirrels because the squirrels are a big problem for that. And then removing the husks is a big pain to do until I just found, again, like a week or two ago, if you take a drill and you want like a nice big like powerful drill, so like the corded ones I think work a little better, and you get a paint stirrer and you throw all your hazelnuts in there, like this is what they look like before, and I threw them in this tub and I just held on for dear life and ran that stirrer, and it just like beat them like crazy, and it just ripped off this husk. And this is what it looked like after, like this up here on the top turned into this with that paint stirrer. So all that husk comes off, and then you would winnow it just like you did with the grain, like I talked about. So like pour it from one tub to the other, and the husky papery material will blow off. And then you have these shells that you'll crack just like you would any other nut. Acorns. So this is a weird one. So this is the one that's processing, and this is the last one I'm going to talk about. So generally, aren't they poisonous? So the answer is yes and no. So acorns have been used as a part of the human diet for a long time. Native Americans throughout North America used them for a long time. They were popular and are still popular among indigenous communities in California. They were like the staple food was acorns in some of the people groups of indigenous California. In Korea, they're still consumed to some degree. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, they are still consumed to some degree. But historically, especially before the development of agriculture, acorns were eaten just about everywhere they grow. They are a great, great staple food. They are mostly carbs, but they have a significant amount of protein and fat. So when you eat them, it's really pretty balanced. It's not like eating a bunch of corn or a bunch of wheat, which are pretty much just carbs. Like when you eat it, it like really feels like you ate something, like it's a pretty hearty food. But they do need to be processed. So it's work. So this is one that's work. But it's one that you don't need a lot of space and you can kind of find for free. You can find a lot for free. So that's why we're going to talk about how to do it, even though it's some work. So which ones you want are generally the white oak group of acorn. These are the easiest to process and the fastest to process. So these would be things like bur oak, white oak, swamp white oak. Those are kind of the best. And all can be eaten if you put the work in. And this is a picture of some bur oak here on the left. So where to find them? Forage for them. I haven't met a person yet who wouldn't let me clean up their yard for free. If you find somebody who's got a whole bunch of acorns in their yard and you knock on the door, they're going to look at you weird. They will. But if you're like, hey, can I take these acorns? And you like tell them what you're doing, nobody's gonna be mad that you came and cleaned up their yard. Or at least I haven't run into anybody yet. Harvesting them is just picking them up. You can use like nut wizards and stuff, or just a rake and a shovel. The indigenous people of California knocked them off the branches. You probably can't do that if you're, getting them from somebody else's tree. If you see any that have little holes in the nut, leave them or collect them and throw them away, because that little hole means there's a bug in there and the nut's no good. So if you see that, so that's after you kind of pick them up, or as you're picking them up, you see them, throw that off to the side or throw it in a different container and get rid of it, because you don't want that bug. You're going to let them dry, just like all these other things we've talked about. Let them dry, let them sit somewhere for a few weeks, and then resort them. Because sometimes it'll, like, you won't see a hole and then the hole will show up because the bug was in there and it just hadn't drilled the hole out yet or something. So kind of resort them and then shell them, crack open the shell, get the kernel out, and then smash them or chop them with a knife. If it's a real big acorn, I do that. If it's like a smaller one, you probably don't have to do that. Or if you have a really nice blender, you don't have to do that. And then you're going to leach them. So the way that you leach them, and this is how you take out the tannins. So the tannins are the thing that are poisonous. So that's if you just crack open an acorn and you eat one, you're not going to die, but you're not going to enjoy it either. They're really bitter. They create this like really unpleasant reaction. But that compound comes out in water. So if you soak them in water, that compound comes out and they're perfectly safe and delicious to eat. The fastest way to do that, and the way that I like to do that, is if you have a really nice blender, you can throw the whole acorn in there or the chopped up acorns, throw it in there, fill it up maybe half full, and then fill the rest of the way with water, and then blend it until it turns into the grossest brown water looking smoothie that you've ever seen. And then let it sit, and then you can kind of dump that water off and then add more water, blend it a little bit more. And you can do that a couple times and the water will start not looking brown anymore. And that means that all of that compound has come out. If you're doing more than just like one blender thing, you can do that process and dump it into some big container, and then add as much as you want, and then let it sit, and then do that whole thing with the container. And then once you do that, once you're not seeing the water turning brown anymore, taste some of it, take a little bit and chew on it. And if it doesn't taste bitter anymore, it's good. And then you don't need to leach it anymore. And then drain all the water off, dehydrate it, and then you can grind it into a flour, or you can leave it as that consistency, which is more kind of like a corn meal. For storage, it's best to freeze it because it does have a fair amount of fat, so it can go rancid. Or you can freeze it kind of wet still, and then just bring it out and dehydrate it or use it fresh. You can do that. Yeah. And yeah, these are just some other ones that you can kind of look into that are different or don't quite fit the category or that like have hulls. But these are other things that do grow well here, but just have some kind of catches to them. But anyways, I'm sorry. I know I went over quite a bit. I usually